going to go ahead and get started again. I hope everyone enjoyed lunch. For folks in the hall, I hope you can head back in, and we're going to go ahead and close the doors. Great, thank you all so much. So I'm very excited for this next panel, the new community development tax landscape. So following the enactment of the One Big Beautiful Bill, what has changed and what lies ahead when it comes to housing and community development tax policies? We have quite the expert panel here, many of our closest advocacy partners, and they're going to unpack how the industry should be preparing for what's next for the low-income housing tax credit, the new markets tax credit, opportunity zones, renewable energy tax credits, and the neighborhood homes tax credit. So please join me in welcoming this next panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Stockton Williams from the National Council of State Housing Agencies, and I have the privilege of moderating this discussion. We have not only a terrific panel, but quite a number of pretty technical topics to get into. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves and say a couple of words about their organization's interest in one or more of the tax credits that we're going to talk about today. So we'll just go right down the line in order with Mike.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, and thanks, Sarah, for the invitation wherever you are out there in the audience, and thanks for all the leadership that you've provided, particularly over the last 6 weeks or so. I'm Mike Novogradic, managing partner of Novogradic. We're a national public accounting and consulting firm, and we focus on affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and clean energy. And I really appreciate the timing of this conference because we have a renewable energy tax credit conference that starts tomorrow in DC. So it saved me from having to make 2 trips to DC, though I get here quite often. Thank you.
Great. Hi. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Catherine Lyons. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Coalitions at the Economic Innovation Group. We are a bipartisan research and policy organization just down the street here in DC. We are most interested today, for the purposes of today's conversation, in opportunity zones. This was a concept that we first essentially came up with in 2015 when we were first founded as an organization. We've been very involved in moving that toward legislation. Once it was passed, we've been also very active in tracking its implementation, and also involved in the regulatory process that kind of led to its implementation as well. We have a very robust coalition of practitioners who have kind of really fed into our work, kind of what's working, what's not, which has really informed our work going forward on how the policy can continue to be improved and enhanced. Many of those recommendations we saw in the reconciliation bill that just passed this summer. So we'll continue to be very involved in the implementation now in phase 2. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Emily Kotick. I'm the CEO of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition. We represent about 275 organizations and businesses and see a lot of familiar faces in this room. We advocate for one program. It's low-income housing tax credit. And so it's been a very exciting year for us, and excited to talk about where we came from, but also especially where we're going next, and appreciate the invitation. So thank you, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi Diarmid. I'm the CEO of MoFi. We're a CDFI and CDE located in Missoula, and we do small business lending across the West. I'm up here today because we helped lead a grassroots effort across the country with about 200 organizations to amplify the policy work that our advocacy groups did in order to secure new markets permanence.
Terrific. So everyone in the room is aware that the tax bill that passed this summer expanded and enhanced a number of important tax credits, including the ones that our panelists mentioned, in a number of ways. And you're probably all up to speed on what happened. But just to level set and make sure, we want to kind of recap not only what the legislation did, but really what it means and the impact that it's going to have. So Heidi, why don't we just start with you, come back down, and tell us a little bit about new markets in the bill. What does the bill do to this program, and what do you think the impact's going to be?
Yeah, so this year we've been on, well, Mike would probably know better than me, but we've been on an extender, I think 9 times. So the New Markets Tax Credit Program allows us to make investments in businesses. And we had either worked on a 1-year extension, a 2-year extension, a 5-year extension. I felt like we were always flying here from Montana to try to work on an extension. It made it really hard for us to plan with our businesses across the country. It made us hard to plan for investors. I think we operated from a place of scarcity because none of us wanted to hire up and really invest in that program. This year, we were about to receive a double round, a $10 billion round, and the program was expiring, and we didn't make it in the House bill. And so it was all hands on deck. We did achieve permanence through a lot of grassroots advocacy. We worked with Senator Daines as our champion. And once we had permanence, I would say everything in the industry feels like it's changed. People are planning for the future. We're lining up projects 3 years in advance. We're able to work with state programs more effectively that often take longer. And we have the staff now to really go out and make sure that the program's amplified across the regions we work in.
Such a huge accomplishment.
Yes.
Congratulations. Mike, you played a huge role as well. Anything to add on the new market story?
Yeah, I certainly would like to also thank Heidi for her great leadership, because it's been a bit of a roller coaster in the community development new market tax credit world over the last 6 months plus period of time. Because as Heidi mentioned, knowing that there was going to be this major tax bill because of the TCJA expirations and the fact that the new market tax credit was scheduled to expire at the end of this year, we thought we were in a great place to get the provision extended, at least get it extended. We wanted permanency. Thanks to the ability to enact permanent tax provisions as part of this budget reconciliation, which I won't go into all those mechanics, but that was something that we didn't know if that was going to be possible or not. But when the bill came out of the House and we weren't in there, we were first optimistic, then we were like, how in the world could it not be in the House bill? And I will say to Chairman Jason Smith's credit, he did come to our New Market Tax Credit Conference after that bill came out and spoke to us and said, yeah, it wasn't in, but don't give up hope. And then there was a big push towards the Senate to get the Senate support, and thanks to Heidi and Senator Daines, they were able to get it in as a permanent provision of the code. So once July 4th came along and the bill was signed, we were really excited about that. And then comes the CDFI fund RIF notice, and then we're excited for the $10 billion round to come out, and then there's the government shutdown. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind within the community development space, and I'm certainly very optimistic about new markets, but it's been an interesting time.
Emily, the low-income housing tax credit has had the benefit of being permanent for more than 30 years, but it was in a different kind of agony more recently, getting close, it seemed, to a major expansion legislatively, and finally this summer it happened. So what happened, and what does it mean?
Yeah, so we did have one similarity to new markets in that we did have one piece of the housing credit that was in need of extension. While the program itself is permanent, we got a 12.5% allocation increase in 2018 that had expired in 2021. And I think, there are so many supporters for the housing credit. I think a lot of people didn't even realize that there had been a cut to the program, but that was really top of mind. And what we saw as hopefully our foot in the door for reconciliation was informing everyone that there was this cut, that the program had actually been expanded under President Trump, that had declined under the previous administration, and trying to at least get that back. But of course, we've been working to do more for many years. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act has been in the works since 2016, and when we get to where we got, I always say it was a lot of people over a lot of years, and there's a lot of people in this room that I've been doing Hill visits with on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act since 2016, or even before it was first introduced. So it was a really concerted advocacy effort, and want to give credit to the state housing agencies, to the Action Campaign, and really to NAAHL, to everyone who was part of it. But getting as much as we did is still something I think a lot of us are still wrapping our heads around, because not only did we get back, we didn't get the 12.5% back, we got a 12% back, but the trade-off was making it permanent, so we don't have to come back in 4 years, which we thought we were going to, and try to get that back again. And more significantly, in terms of production, we got the 50% bond financing test lowered to 25%, which really dwarfs that allocation increase in terms of the impact estimates. And thanks to Novogradac, we know that those two provisions together are going to finance 1.2 million more affordable homes over the next 10 years than otherwise possible, which is the kind of policy win I think those of us who advocate could only dream of having at any point in our careers. And just for scale, the last time we had a huge win, which was enacting the minimum 4% housing credit rate in 2020, the estimate of that was that it would finance another 126,000 affordable homes over the next 10 years. So we're talking 10 times the impact of the last industry-changing, life-changing win that we had. So the way we got it done was, a lot of people over a lot of years, but I think more significantly, especially with all of the pressures that we're facing the reconciliation bill, looking for cuts, looking for, anything that can offset some other priority, was we had to have members of Congress willing to say, maybe they'll do it more quietly than some other members, but you're not getting my vote if we don't put in the low-income housing tax credit. And having enough other members to support them to say, okay, we've got a block here that if we don't put something in on the low-income housing tax credit, this bill's not going to make it to the president's desk. And so Darren LaHood was that voice for us in the House. Todd Young was that voice for us in the Senate. But even before that, last year, as I'm sure we all painfully remember, we almost got different versions of those provisions. And in that case, it was a bipartisan negotiation where Senator Maria Cantwell was willing to be that person, and Ron Wyden was willing to be that person. And so it's cultivating these champions who aren't just willing to put their name on the bill or even lead the bill, but that when it actually comes down to these trade-offs are willing to go to leadership and be that member that says, I'm standing in the way of our party achieving its goals here. So thank you to everyone who helped cultivate those champions and their supporters around the country, because I know the conversation is already starting to move on to, what are we doing on the demand side, which we're very excited to get to work on, but I just don't want anyone to let the moment go by too quickly of what our advocacy accomplished and what it's going to mean for millions of people.
So Catherine, opportunity zones were in a different dynamic than these two tax credits. Popular on both sides of the aisle, and something that we knew President Trump wanted to see continued in some form in the tax bill. But there was also among a lot of OZ supporters a desire to actually change some of the ways that OZ works. So tell us what eventually transpired in the bill.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in also a little bit of a different situation in that OZs don't expire in terms of the investment or deferral window until the end of next year. But of course, tax bills only come around every so often, and so wanted to, of course, take advantage of that opportunity, and knew, of course, as you said, that this was a priority for the administration and for both sides of the aisle in Congress. And so, what we historically over the last several years, there have been bipartisan pieces of legislation, the Opportunity Zones Transparency Extension and Improvement Act, that did aim to fix the policy, improve the policy, make it more effective in certain ways. And so we had kind of a foundation of what those consensus priorities were, both from the practitioner and the kind of stakeholder side of things, but also, on the record in Congress, having bipartisan support for this legislation as well. So we were starting kind of from that foundation, but knew that we wanted to figure out, ways in which it could be made even more improved for both the investor community, but also for communities, beyond just permanency. Permanency by far was the #1 goal, so that everyone can also plan and have that certainty kind of moving forward. So we did achieve that, and now it is also like new markets, a permanent part of the tax code. Though the maps themselves will be updated every 10 years, and that's because we want to ensure that the maps reflect actually as close as we can, kind of the on the ground kind of economic conditions of these communities. If they graduate out because they've been so successful in kind of receiving OZ investment, they should no longer be OZs, in the future. And so that will now be as OZ itself is permanent. That will be a permanent part of this too. The maps will kind of redesignate every 10 years through the same process as before. Governors choosing 25% of their eligible low-income communities as opportunity zones through a process that the statute now lays out, going forward. A couple of additional things things kind of changed in this bill as well. One is the incentive structure. While the three major incentives, the deferral, the step up in basis, and the permanent exclusion on your appreciation of your investment after 10 years, those all remain the same, but it's structured a little differently. Now there'll be a 5-year rolling deferral, so time to the date of investment. So we won't have these kind of somewhat arbitrary peaks and valleys that we have seen with the expirations of those step-up benefits over the life of the policy in 1.0, and also, the kind of decreasing fundraising we're seeing right now as the deferral gets less valuable as we get closer to that 2026 date. That will be now smoothed out, which we're really excited about. That was a hope and dream, and to the fact that we got that in, and that was, and the champions in the Senate especially got that done, was a huge win, I think, for everybody, and it's really smoothing out the flow of capital, both for investors and communities that are receiving that. There's also a heavy emphasis on rural provisions now. So the benefits are much stronger for opportunity zones that are in rural areas, which the USDA has defined and will kind of define in the future for 2.0. They've already come out with maps for 1.0 on what that means. But that will be, the step up in basis will be 30% instead of the standard 10%. So that is a real intention, especially by Chairman Jason Smith in the Ways and Means Committee. He made it very clear that he didn't feel like OZs, and this generally bears out in the data, that OZs have not been used as much in rural places. They wanted to figure out a way to change that. And so the incentive is much stronger now for those places. We'll see how that certainly bears out, but that will, certainly will likely have an impact on how investors are looking at this incentive going forward. We'll look at reporting and transparency, a huge one as well for everybody. I think that has been a broad and kind of deep coalition, both on the Hill and off, of wanting to see that happen, and so that's now going to happen starting in 2026. There will also be a narrower criteria for choosing the places that ultimately will be eligible for the map. And so we anticipate the map will be about 20% smaller in 2.0, so starting in 2027, because of the kind of tightened criteria that will ultimately lead to kind of a higher degree of distress in terms of the places that are ultimately chosen as OZs. So those are all things that were part of our recommendations, part of the OZ working group recommendations from Novogradac. So these are shared, and building a long track record of building that consensus, building on those priorities, determining those very early on in the process, and then going regularly to the Hill with practitioners to make that clear, make that known, as what we hope to see in the bill. That many of which were unfortunately some things were left out. We're hoping to see some of those corrected for in regulations or in future legislation. There's, now that there's permanency, we have a longer runway for further improving this. But many of those key priorities were included, and that's much to the kind of credit of those really truly advocating for this by telling their stories of the projects and districts, and also really coming out with kind of more data on the impact of OZs, especially on housing, which I can get to a little bit later too.
We're going to get into the implementation issues, which are many across all of these, but it wasn't all great news with respect to community development and energy and environmental tax credits in the bill. So, Michael, you tell us in summary, because it's more than a couple things,
You're right.
what happened to some of the energy-related provisions in the code as a result of the Big Beautiful Act.
Yes, so the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did pare back clean energy tax credits. And as I mentioned, we have a conference tomorrow and Friday to go through a number of those sort of changes. And how one goes about talking about what it did to clean energy in a few minutes is quite challenging. I will note, though, that in the outside of the clean energy space, those in affordable housing in particular, there was this initial sense that because what they read about the pare back of renewable energy credits and the rest, that maybe we'd be getting the low-income housing tax credit and affordable housing community might get all these investors shifting over, and that could help increase demand given the increased supply of low-income tax credits over the next 10 years. That is not going to happen anytime soon. The clean energy credits, the ones that were most directly affected is solar and wind. And solar and wind credits, if you're looking to develop solar or wind project, you have until July 4th of next year to begin construction and still be eligible for the credits. And once you begin construction, you have 4 years to place the property in service. So over the next 3 to 4 years, we don't expect much of a decrease in the volume of renewable energy tax credits over that period of time. There's anecdotal stories of some investors moving out of renewable energy, but for the most part, they're not. And transferability of renewable energy credits was preserved. So the renewable energy community right now is really focused on what they need to do over the next 12 months, slightly less than 12 months to begin construction, and then roll those properties into service over the next 4 years. I'd also note that the market itself is about $40 to $50 billion a year. Light-Tech's about $25 billion. New markets maybe $2 billion, subject to the $10 million round, which will make it $4 briefly. And historic tax credits are $1 billion. So clearly, renewable energy is very large. And even if the solar and wind credits do phase out in 4 years through all the properties either having been placed in service or not being eligible, the number of the other credits, the battery storage, geothermal, nuclear, those go out several years beyond that, and that's probably 20 to 25 billion of the 50. So clean energy is here. It's here for a long time, and there are 2 national elections over that 4-year period. Obviously, next year, the House and a third of the Senate, and then 2 years later, the presidency, the House, and a third of the Senate. So the demise, if you will, of renewable energy credits, it's certainly scheduled right now. And the longer, to the extent they do sort of expire in terms of new projects after July 4th of next year in the solar and wind space, the longer that happens, the harder it is to sort of bring it back. But it's still a very viable industry for the foreseeable future. And I'll leave it at that.
And we'll come back several more times to give you a chance to unpack that a little bit further, Mike. I just also wanted to mention that for NAAHL, for NCSHA, for many of us here, a new tax proposal to create a credit for rehabbing and constructing single-family homes. Some of you know it as the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. That was also left out of the big, beautiful bill. So that's an opportunity for future advocacy, which, as Mike suggested, is always a reality. But let's, before we get to the future, let's talk about the immediate present and putting to work these expansions of the incentives that did get expanded, and start on new markets, and invite the panel to respond in any fashion they would like. What's sort of top of mind? What has to happen now? What are you most focused on in terms of optimizing this long-sought permanence of the NMTC?
You want me to go first, Mike?
I'm happy to go first. You can go first.
I'll say a couple things that are on my mind. I think there's a lot of scrutiny on the federal programs. And so each thing that happens, it feels like each step needs a shepherd to get through that step. And for new markets, I don't know how it works for Light-Tech, but there are awards, there are allocation agreements, there are new applications. I think we should anticipate that each one of those is going to need support and might have a magnifying glass on it. And I think that every one of us that is out there working in our communities, looking at the jobs numbers that are created, we need to remember that it's our eyes and ears and our impacts that need to get back to the folks on the Hill. And that if we're closing deals, if we're making promises to businesses, if we're working with mayors and city planners, that the last part of that job needs to be bringing all of that data back to DC so that people can see what's happening. I was very nervous about being in DC in 2012 when I got asked to come here for the first time. And I don't think I've gotten any better at it, but I've at least gotten more comfortable with it. And my goal over the next year is to build an army of advocates who can take their eyes and ears back to everyone they've elected to make sure that we can get it through each step as we implement the new markets tax credit across the country.
Did you want to add anything?
I would just sort of add that we're very focused on getting this $10 billion round out. And for those of you who don't know, the new market tax credit is now permanent at $5 billion of allocation issuance authority, which is roughly $2 billion in credits a year. There is a double round that is we think it's essentially the awardees have essentially been determined. We just have to get the government opened up again for the awards to be given. So there'll be this $10 billion round coming out. And then from a sort of a regulation administration perspective, there'll then be a subsequent $5 billion round. And I would just note that every administration ends up putting their own imprint on new market tax credit competitions. I remember when Obama became president, food deserts became kind of something that was really focused on, so that became a sort of a priority within new market tax credits. I certainly expect within new market tax credits for there to be leaning into opportunity zones in terms of trying to have more new market tax credit investment going into opportunity zones. I also expect there to be more of a focus on job creation and economic activity. And I just say that this is something that we go through with every new administration. They always look at it and say, these are our priorities, and this is a government program that gets administered by the executive branch, and as a way of identifying, and it is a competition, the strength of the new market tax credit, just as with low-income tax credits and a number of other tax incentives, is it is a competition. So you're able to drive it towards those areas that you're most focused on from a policy perspective that's consistent with the underlying legislation. So we're just in the process of kind of waiting for the government to open up again and hoping that the CDFI fund RIF is pulled back. So the CDFI fund will be in existence past the middle of December, because they are the agency that administers the new market tax credit. And obviously we want the CDFI fund to be around for a lot of reasons, but within the narrow view of the new market tax credit, that's one of them.
Emily, with respect to the low-income housing tax credit, it was expanded in a couple of ways, as you mentioned. You are now working closely with the major investors who provide the capital that has made the program successful. How are they looking at the expanded supply of credits, and also thinking about what it might suggest for what state housing agencies, affordable housing owners, and developers should be thinking about in this expanded environment?
Yeah, so before I answer that, I just want to take a step back and go down memory lane to 2017, when we were all fighting to preserve private activity bonds, which would have meant the loss of 1 million units. And now we have, I don't know if I want to call it a problem, but we have the best possible problem, which is how are we going to raise the $5 to $7 billion we need for all of these new credits that are now in the market. So just with that context, we do need $5 to $7 billion more dollars of private investment. And there's a few ways that we think this can. So first of all, Federal Housing Finance Agency announced in August that Fannie and Freddie are going to be able to do $1 billion more apiece of housing credit equity. Then, of course, if you want to account for the rest of it, there are going to be existing investors who do more, and then there's going to be the need for new investors. So we're working on a number of different policies that will help on both of those fronts. So one is exciting because it's already passed the Senate, and a House bill was introduced yesterday, so very hot off the presses. And that is the proposal to lift the public welfare investment cap from 15% to 20%. So we did a survey, and thank you to NAAHL and the Affordable Housing Investors Council for helping us get this out to banks. This isn't the full universe of housing credit investors, but we did get responses from 22 banks who represented about $14 billion of bank investment in housing credit in 2024, so about 2/3 of the bank investment. And of that, 42% came from banks who are hitting up against that 15% cap. So, we didn't ask them, will you do more if it's lifted? We don't know how much more they'll do, but it at least gives you an idea of the scale of how much capital is being invested by banks that tax capacity permitting would potentially be able to do more if the PWI cap were lifted. So there's really no opposition we found. The only challenge we have is the government is shut down. Fortunately, this is right now riding on a defense reauthorization bill, which we'll take any vehicle we can get, and if they want to put affordable housing on the defense bill, then we're all now advocating for the defense bill. So, but one thing that's great about that, aside from bolstering our national defense, is it does have to get signed into law this year. That's pretty much the one thing that always gets signed into law. So right now, this proposal to lift the PWI cap is part of that because it passed as part of the Road to Housing, and that was included as an amendment. So what we're hoping for is, as this defense bill goes to the House in conference, that they will keep on, ideally much of the Road to Housing bill, at least this PWI proposal. But if it doesn't make it on the defense bill, I think there is still a lot of bipartisan energy to do something on housing in this Congress. And unlike a tax bill where you kind of have to wait for that, unicorn bill to come along, and it includes all kinds of parts of the tax code, things that aren't tax proposals can ride on a lot of different vehicles. So considering it's already passed the Senate, it's got the support of Senate Banking Committee Chairman Tim Scott, I think this is something we could actually see get through, and even get through, regardless of what happens with the government, because they will still pass this defense bill at some point, we hope. Aside from that, we're starting to talk about, what is the next, we're all here talking about different things we'd like in the next tax bill. To be clear, nobody is really thinking there's much appetite for another tax bill in the immediate term, but there will be a need for another tax bill at some point. And so we're talking about things like extending the carryback period for the housing credit, easing the limitation on how much of your general business, how much that banks can use general business credits. So there's a few things that we think could help. None of them are going to be a silver bullet on the demand issue, but if we could get a few of them done, especially over these coming years, I think that we could certainly make it a more attractive credit and help raise some of that equity that we'll need. And I would also just mention, these don't have to do with demand specifically, but we did get the two major pieces of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act done. There's 25 of them left. There was a huge rural preference for opportunity zones. I was surprised that the rural basis boost for the housing credit fell out when the bill went from the House to the Senate. That was part of the trade-off to make the other provisions permanent. But there are still these pieces there that we're still advocating for. So it's going to be an interesting exercise that we're all going through with the industry, with our leads on the Hill, as to what does this new menu that we've all been operating off of for so many years look like, especially because the last few years, even though all of our groups had different things we'd like to see changed, we all agreed, let's just keep introducing the same bill, get all those co-sponsors back. We've got the most popular bipartisan tax bill in Congress. Let's not, threaten that by adding anything new. But now we are going to need to rewrite it because of the good reason, which is we got part of it done. And so I think we've got a good opportunity to say, what are the most important pieces, both from the existing bill and then in the new environment, recognizing this bill is 10 years old now and things have changed quite a bit.
Mike, you've done a lot of analysis of how affordable housing lenders, developers, and housing finance agencies ought to be thinking about making the most of the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit. Could you share some of that and refer people to your excellent website where there's a lot of further analysis than you can probably describe today?
Just go to novoco.com, Affordable Housing Resource Center. And also give kudos to Peter Lawrence, our Chief Public Policy Officer, who's in the back, who really leads a lot of this analysis effort, and I get to sit up here and take credit for it. But with respect to the ability to achieve the 1.2 million new units over the next 10 years financed by this bill, as Emily mentioned earlier, it does take the appropriate steps by housing agencies throughout the country. The bill creates this capacity to take the existing amount of private activity bond authority that states have been using for multifamily residential rental housing combined with the low-income housing tax credits and basically double the production. They have that ability by lowering the 50% test. However, it does take actions by the various state agencies to not award as much private activity bonds to a given project, lowering the amount that they award any one particular project, and thus they can award more projects with the existing bond volume authority. Now, if a state ends up saying, we're just going to do the same amount and just give less bond volume authority and use that bond volume authority for something besides residential rental, we're not going to hit those numbers. So obviously, state agencies need to at least keep the same amount of bond authority going to residential rental, and then also lowering the amount. And then obviously, or maybe not so obviously, but for someone who's an accountant like me and for all of you doing finance, if you do lower the amount of private activity bonds awarded any one project, you do create a small additional financing need that can be dealt with a variety of ways. Also, a number of states have been using private activity bond volume cap for new construction. And if you're doing new construction with private activity bonds, normally you need other soft financing. And other self-financing doesn't necessarily automatically scale once the tax bill passes. So the state governments and local governments will have to come up with more gap financing to hit these numbers, or they can look and say, you know something, for those states that have been really promoting new construction to the point that if you had an existing transaction that you wanted to preserve, you wanted to renovate an existing transaction, preserve it, or take market rate housing, renovate it, and commit it to affordable housing, you couldn't compete for bonds. A lot of public housing that goes through the RAD, Rental Assistance Administration Program transformation, having trouble getting access to private activity bonds in their states because there's this focus on new construction. So to the extent that the various states can at least maintain the existing amount of private activity bonds, lower the amount that they're awarding to each project, come up with more soft financing, or open it up to more acquisition and rehab, we will see, if states do that uniformly, 1.2 million more units over the next 10 years, and potentially even more. So it's a great opportunity, and with great opportunity comes great responsibility. So I do think I would encourage all of you to be working with your state agencies to ensure that they're maximizing the production they can with this new, this expanded resource for development of affordable rental housing and preservation.
We're going to come back to some of those excellent points. But Catherine, unlike NMTCs and LIHTCs, OZs were expanded and also enhanced in certain ways. And the Treasury Department actually has some work to do to enable the expansion to achieve the impact that we hope and expect it will. So can you talk a little bit about what needs to happen starting at Treasury, and then if you want to also talk about market participants' next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, Treasury does have some regs to write in terms of what does 2.0 look like, and they've already started. So we know that this work is well underway. Right before the shutdown happened, just in the nick of time, they did release guidance on the rural provision, and as I mentioned, kind of released the map of what the current OZ map and what actually qualifies as a rural OZ, because one of those benefits is actually already active, a lowered substantial improvement threshold for qualifying projects in these rural OZs. And so they did get that guidance out. They also kind of previewed that they were going to put out additional guidance on, of course, the 2.0 maps, which everyone is very eager to learn more about what that will look like, kind of what data they'll use to determine eligibility, and then ultimately kind of what those maps will look like. CDFI fund, of course, is likely to play a very important role in that. So again, the rifts there will, likely, if not sort of reversed or upheld, that will likely affect the ability for them to put out that eligibility list and those maps in a timely manner. But that is setting that aside. That is something that we know that they're working on. They're also working on providing any additional kind of either new forms or kind of new guidance for the reporting and transparency requirements, which will be will start kind of in effect at the next taxable year, so in 2026. So of course, it would be very good for opportunity funds and investors to know what they'll be on the hook for reporting and how to do that, at the beginning of the year if possible. So these are all things that are very immediate guidance. We're also very aware of transition rules. A lot of investors and fund managers need clarity now to figure out what happens if the projects that we're pursuing right now in an opportunity zone, if that no longer is an opportunity zone, after 2028, what happens to those projects? Can we continue to pursue them? Especially if they're multi-phase. How much investment needs to already have occurred in these projects in order for them to essentially be grandfathered in? So, we've been thinking about that. Certainly, yes. The Novocratic OZ working group has been thinking about that and putting together a lot of scenarios, which I think they just submitted to Treasury, for as an input, to help inform their thinking. I think that's probably the most pressing, especially from the kind of investor fund manager community. They just really need to know and have that certainty going forward on what this looks like as we transition, maps and as we transition from 1.0 to 2.0. So there are also consensus priorities like we would like to see done in regulations. This gets to some of the things things that we were that didn't ultimately get included in the reconciliation bill, but in particular, and of particular importance to us, is figuring out ways to make this work better for operating business investments. And so we'll be thinking through some ways that hopefully that can be done in regs, in addition to potential future legislation too. But those are some of those immediate guidance. We're hoping that they will address as soon as the shutdown is over, and especially on the new maps, ideally before the end of this year, because states are really, and this is really where we've been putting a lot of focus. Even though in statute, states have, or the kind of determination period for the next round of OZs is not till July 1st, 2026. What we keep saying and harping on is that if you're starting then, you're starting way too late. And we also have the benefit of time. Hopefully we should have clarity on the new maps by the end of the year. If not directly from Treasury, our two groups can certainly put together, as long as we know which data sets are ultimately going to be used to determine eligibility, maps are pretty easy to come up with. And then governors, and state and local policymakers really have an important role to play, because determining your zones is ultimately going to determine the success of the policy. And that is the biggest lever that local policymakers have to kind of determine the outcomes that they want to see in their designated communities. And so that is really what we're working on. We're going to come out with some guidance for governors in the next couple of weeks that we hope will be a very helpful resource, learning lessons from 1.0, applying those moving forward, and just generally kind of hoping to shape their thinking on what will work really well and what are some of the key characteristics that will make a successful OZ.
I just wanted to emphasize those are all sort of great points, and I agree with all of them, as you know. I wanted to emphasize some of the immediate guidance that's needed, and through our Opportunity Zones Working Group, which is led by my partner Jason Watkins, we first came out with a letter of where we need immediate guidance, then we're going to come out with recommendations on the implementation of the new tracks, which we think of as OZ 2.0 tracks. And then there are broader recommendations that we have, so more of the investment go into operating businesses, and affordable, rent-restricted, income-restricted rental housing. But in terms of the immediate guidance, many people aren't aware that the existing tracks, we believe, don't expire until December 31, 2028. And those are the OZ 1.0 tracks. And the OZ 2.0 tracks would start January 1 of 2027. So there's going to be this 2-year period of these overlapping tracks, we believe. And we want to get confirmation from Treasury that interpretation is correct. And as Catherine pointed out, we want to know what happens when a tract expires. What level, how do you know that how do you know that you're going to be a legacy project and you're going to be eligible if you don't get placed in service till after 2028 if you're in one of these transitional tracks? And we put through a series of questions or fact scenarios, and we've proposed some regulatory language that came out of one of the earlier sort of Opportunity Zone bills, proposed that to Treasury. And if Treasury doesn't come out with that guidance sometime soon, you're going to start to see a decrease of investment in existing opportunity zones by virtue of the fact that investors don't know what these transition rules are. So that it's very important that we get that guidance. And then obviously at the same time, we've got to be focused on rolling out and selecting the new zones, as well as revisiting the regulations themselves. When you think about the regulatory effort around opportunity zones, I've never worked in any tax incentive that is as cross-cutting as opportunity zones are throughout the entire tax code, from a state, international. It was such a massive effort that the fact that Treasury got it done in as brief a period of time as they did after it was enacted in 2017 is pretty amazing. But now there's an opportunity to go in with a little bit more of a scalpel and change some of the regulatory provisions that, back in the day, there wasn't enough bandwidth to get that narrow and that nuanced. So I'm quite optimistic that we can have some level of success on the regulatory front as well to expand the reach of opportunity zones. And I do want to ask everyone here to just think in your mind, how much do you think has been invested in opportunity zones since it was enacted in 2017? And the number is likely, give a second to think about it, it's over $100 billion. think about that number, over $100 billion. That's a lot of capital that's been driven into opportunity zones. And I got to give it back to Catherine to talk about the impact it's had on residential rental housing.
Yes.
Because I'm an all of the above houser, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's $100 billion into at least 6,500 communities. I mean, at least 3/4 of the map, we believe, have seen investment. So it's a massive at scale. For housing, so we've done some original research on looking at the impact of OZs on actually the causal impact. How can we track how OZs have actually caused development in designated communities? The top line findings here are that in our sample, and we're using USPS and HUD data here to kind of determine this, 416,000 new residential housing units have been created because of the OZ incentive in designated communities. The total for the actual amount of housing developed in OZs since they took effect and through the end of Q1 of this year is close to 900,000 new residential addresses, so new residential units. And then OZs can take credit for about 40% of those. So that helps kind of solve the question I think that a lot of folks had very initially in the policy's life was like, is there a kind of, what's the but-for case? Are these things that are going to happen already, or, and they're just kind of plussing this up? Or is it actually changing investor behavior? And at least in this use case of housing, we can pretty definitively say yes, that OZs have actually caused a change in investor behavior and actually caused the development of at least 40% of the new developments happening in OZs to the tune of about 416,000 units. So.
Terrific. I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then we're going to open it up to your questions and comments. So please be ready for that. But just want to ask everyone, in maybe the order that we started down at the end, to just share any final thoughts on something that you're most excited about, something that you're most concerned about, kind of what is on your mind that we haven't discussed with respect to all the different tax incentives that we've gone over today?
I think what's on my mind maybe I'll just stay with exciting because I spend most of my life in fear right now. I think the exciting part is now that we have permanence, thinking about what scaling, about what modernization, about the number of jobs that we can create and in what communities we can do it. And kind of going back to what Emily said, like, what's our new wish list? I know we need to get through this tough period with the CDFI fund, but I think permanence on the new market side has really changed the way we're thinking about the future.
And a permanent new markets tax credit is yet one more reason why we're going to need a CDFI fund. So
yes.
Important to remind some folks of that. Emily, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'm excited about a couple of things. And one is I wanted to go back to a point Heidi made earlier about the importance of showing what you're now going to be building to members of Congress. So I know you all have been great at that in the housing credit world, but being able to bring them out, and especially with Republican members saying, this was possible because you had this housing credit expansion in one big beautiful bill, which, some of them really fought for. I think some people are still unpacking kind of what was in the bill and just, making sure everybody knows you voted for the biggest expansion in the housing credit ever. This became possible because of that. I think, so I'm excited about that opportunity. But what I'm also excited about that has kind of surprised me is I was wondering, we all kind of took a minute to read the room after one big beautiful bill passed of, how soon can we go back and ask for anything else on affordable housing? All of our political capital tank was empty, right? And so I was curious to see if everyone was going to say, we kind of took care of housing and come back to us much later. But it's been the opposite. So between, FHFA making the announcement soon after and then Road to Housing, there was this kind of unprecedented bipartisan housing markup in banking. What was it, a month after? With all of these proposals that had been kind of on the sidelines getting packaged together. Now it's passed the Senate, it's been attached to defense, and even just in the few months since the ink was dry on the bill, we've been getting all kinds of members of Congress reaching out and saying, what do you think about this new idea or that new idea? And so it seems like it's almost the opposite of we took care of housing, but rather everyone, like the dam kind of broke on this long overdue action on affordable housing. So starting with the PWI cap, but even just thinking over the next few years, both parties are really interested in doing something in affordable housing, and we now have some things to build on, some real wins here. So I'm excited to see just what else could come after, especially in the housing credit world. It was 5 years between the last win and this next one. I don't think we're going to be waiting 5 years for the next one.
There's a lot to be excited for in the world of kind of opportunity zones. I mean, at first, I'm really excited about working with and seeing what governors' offices do to really kind of set up a robust, kind of transparent set of processes for how to choose the selection of their zones, and I think it's going to yield a really stellar map kind of going forward, especially with some of the new criteria changes too. So looking forward to that. I'm looking forward, as Mike alluded to as well, the fact that we do have an opportunity in the regulatory process to potentially not only pursue kind of the right or to see this kind of implemented as Congress intended for 2.0, but also potentially to see some changes that are some of our consensus priorities that are much more long-standing, including trying to facilitate the production of more affordable and workforce housing as well, and trying to again see those either done hopefully in the regulatory process. And I think this administration hopefully will be very kind of open to those suggestions. And so I'm looking forward to having productive conversations with Treasury and IRS as that moves forward. And I'm also just really looking forward to continuing to tell the story through our own housing data, but also through a lot of the work that practitioners are doing all across the country. We have so many more, housing units in service now. We have so many more projects that are actually online because of OZs, and so that has the more that we have in the bank, in the story bank, is going to continue to tell that. Those successes and kind of share those messages to Congress, that makes our job so much easier. And so I'm just really looking forward to seeing more and more of those things come online and, continuing to share those with members of Congress, and obviously seeing even more of that kind of going forward, which our reporting requirements will actually allow us to get a much better sense of at the national level and in a much more contemporaneous way. So as the researchers, and speaking for the research side of our work, I mean, we are looking forward to getting that kind of national data that will give us a much better sense of how these communities are faring, but also what actual activity is taking place because of opportunity zones.
Thanks, Mike.
So in addition to advocacy for more resources than the rest, I'm really excited about the expanding the focus. Not that it hasn't been there before, but really focusing on how can we make all the existing incentives more efficient at all levels. How do we increase the demand of investors? We want more investors bidding for these tax credits. One of the beauties of the public-private partnership is that competition. So what can we do to make the various incentives more attractive to investors? Without much additional cost to the government. I say without much because theoretically it shouldn't have any cost, but it always costs something. But you look at like markets, if individuals could invest through being able to offset alternative minimum tax with new market tax credits, that would expand the investor base for individuals. As Emily mentioned, for corporate investors in long-term tax credits, if they could increase the amount of the tax credit they could use to offset their current tax liability, that would increase the amount of demand from existing investors already there are doing it and bring in sort of more investors. That's almost a given that you should want something like that. And then there's also, if we could go back and find ways to lower the cost of housing, right? You could get so much more production. If you could lower the cost of housing 30%, you get more than 30% from existing long-term tax credit resources. But the various ways in which you could go through, and either through legislative changes at the state level, changes in the opportunity zones regulations that would allow the existing resources to produce more, that's win-win-win. It's win for the communities that get served. It's win for the federal government in the sense that they're getting more from existing resources. It's win for the taxpayers. So that's just something that I think it warrants a lot of attention, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And it's something that we don't have to wait for a big bill to happen for some of these provisions to put into place. And I would just ask everybody to be thinking about those ways in which you can get more from the existing resources and act to do that.
That's a great way to conclude. Okay, we've got some time for questions. I'm actually going to stand so I can see the whole audience here. And first hand up is right here. If you wouldn't mind standing up so we can hear.
There's a microphone. Is it working?
Oh, there's a mic. Yeah, great.
That's pretty handy. A great panel, by the way. Really enjoyed everything you were sharing. And you should all be applauded for efforts that over the years you're finally seeing the fruits of them. in a time that's so trying. So congratulations to each of you for that. But I did want to ask Catherine just one technical question, I guess. You know, I've been in CRA for a long time, and CRA, just like opportunity zones, they're not meant to keep those impoverished areas poor. You want to see the lift as a result of the work that's occurring. But I was just curious by the one statistic that you shared with the 416,000 housing units that were developed as a result of opportunity zone investments. Is there any breakdown in terms of the number of those that are considered to be affordable housing or not?
Unfortunately, the data sets that we're using for that do not break that down or delineate between market rate or workforce or affordable. So that's just the data set doesn't unfortunately have that information. But what we'll say, I think just anecdotally and certainly what we know from other kind of surveys and things like that is that OZs have been particularly successful in creating workforce housing. So kind of that missing middle, 80 to 120% of AMI, that is what OZs have been very, again, successful in sort of driving new development around. I think the other thing is that OZs are obviously flexible, right? And so they're used for a lot of different places, some of which need more affordable housing, certainly, some of which have a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing, and they actually want more market rate. And so it actually is able to kind of address all of those kind of unique, needs of that particular community. What we also know too, and what this other housing research that has been done on OZs in particular has shown that rents have remained stable in opportunity zones, in part because it is driving so much more production. And so production of any type of housing leads to greater affordability kind of generally. And that's being borne out in some of the research on especially urban areas and OZs in urban areas that have shown that rents have remained stable because OZs have led to an increase in production, and sort of that filtering effect has kind of led to an increased affordability, or at least a stability of affordability in these markets.
I just want to emphasize that with respect to the spillover effects, I'm always amazed as an econ undergrad, but I don't think you need an econ undergrad to have this realization. When you think of increasing the supply of something, normally people think the price is going to come down. Housing is one of the weird areas where when you survey the population, if you say, well, the increase in the amount of workforce housing units lower the cost, lower the cost of rents other places, or at least lower the rate of increase, most will say no. They'll say new housing drives rents up, which is kind of, I'm always amazed by that. I don't know what messaging we need to do as a housing community to be for supply, to realize that all of us in this room know more supply is going to help with that, ease that burden.
Over here. Thanks, Stockton. In my estimation, one of the critical hindrances of a more affordable housing has been the capital requirements of the banks, right? I mean, it's great that we get public welfare for RWA purposes for light tech, but like when you look at the default history and the performance of this asset class over a long history, there's really no reason for this amount of capital to be held by the banks. And obviously, Basel III endgame is being looked at again. Like any sort of commentary there, whether it's on the lobbying side or whether it's just, in your conversations in the room about that topic. Because to me, that's really what would open up capital, right? Pricing would increase and there'd be more capital deployed in the marketplace. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when the regulatory agencies were looking at raising capital requirements, they were going to be raising capital requirements for renewable energy and a number of other areas. The Affordable Tax Credit Coalition joined in and other groups on not just keeping the capital requirements for long-term tax credit and other sort of equity investments the same, but actually lowering them. And submitted a letter making the case that the capital requirements should have been lower. And even if they just stayed the same, if all the other capital requirements went up, we would be a lot more attractive, relatively. But that ended up obviously going away, and now there's talk of revisiting the capital requirements, just lowering them more generally across different asset classes. So I do think when you look at this, if those of you who have been to my affordable housing conference before know I have all these different sort of ways in which you could increase equity investor demand among the various investors, and one of them is the capital requirements and trying to lower the weighting. So there have been efforts that are ongoing to lower that capital weighting for affordable housing, long-term tax credit generally, and just more housing more widely. And I totally agree with you. If you lower those capital requirements, there's no single way to drive demand, but directionally that would increase the amount of capital available, which would generate more housing.
We're right up against our time, so please join me in thanking this terrific panel.